The notary handed me back my pen, and I remember thinking it was heavier than it should have been. My brother-in-law Russ was already typing something on his phone, his thumb moving fast, the way it does when he thinks no one is watching. My sister Lee was standing near the window with her back to me, and her shoulders had that particular set to them, the kind that says a person is trying very hard not to look relieved too soon. I had just signed my name across the bottom of a document that transferred my 50% stake in our family's landscaping company, a business my father had built from a single truck and a borrowed mower, over to her. And I felt, strangely, very calm. I should start earlier than that. The lobby scene doesn't make sense without the 18 months that came before it. My father started the company the year I was born. Evergreen Property Services. He named it that because he said the name sounded like something that would last, and he was right, it did last. 31 years, 12 full-time employees, contracts with 3 county municipalities and a regional hospital campus. He ran it out of a converted garage in our neighborhood until I was 9, and then out of a small office on Briar Mill Road until the week he went into the hospital for the last time. He was methodical about everything. He kept handwritten ledgers going back to 1994, even after he switched to accounting software. He laminated his vehicle maintenance logs. He built the kind of business that runs on habit and consistency and shows up whether it's raining or not. And he built it the same way he parented, which was to say quietly, without fanfare, and with more faith in the people around him than they usually deserved. I am 31 years old. I have a degree in business administration with a concentration in finance. For the last 6 years, I have worked as a financial analyst at a regional credit union, which means I spend my days building loan risk models, reviewing operating statements, flagging exposure in commercial accounts. It is not glamorous work. It does not come up at parties. But it means that when someone puts a set of financial documents in front of me, I am not looking at numbers. I am reading a story, and I know how to tell when the story has been edited. My sister Lee is 5 years older than me. She has lived in the same suburb for most of her adult life, drives the kind of car that requires a specific dealership for oil changes, and has been married to Russ since I was in college. Russ sells commercial real estate. He is the kind of man who enters rooms at a volume slightly above what the room requires. He and Lee have been involved in the company's operations in a peripheral way for years. Lee sometimes covered the front desk when my father's office manager was out. Russ occasionally referred clients, but neither of them had ever done the work. The scheduling, the payroll, the equipment procurement, the contract negotiations, the calls at 6 in the morning when a crew truck broke down on the way to a municipal site. I had done a lot of that. Not all of it. My father was sharp until very close to the end, but enough that when he sat me down in October of last year and told me he was putting both of us on the company's ownership structure equally, I understood what he was doing. He was trying to be fair. He was also, I think, trying to protect something he built from a version of the future he could see coming but couldn't say out loud. He died in March. Pancreatic cancer, which is fast and unkind and does not negotiate. He was 63 years old. He had told me once that he planned to work until 70, and I believe he would have. The week after the funeral, before I had fully remembered how to sleep a full night, Lee called me and said we needed to talk about the company. I thought she meant operationally. I thought she meant the transition, the staff, the contracts coming up for renewal in April. Instead, she and Russ came to my apartment on a Wednesday evening, and Russ set a folder on my kitchen table the way people set down things they want you to feel were prepared carefully on your behalf. The folder contained what he described as a valuation summary. He walked me through it with the patient energy of someone explaining something to a person they do not expect to understand it. According to the documents inside, Evergreen Property Services had significant outstanding liabilities, deferred equipment loans, a line of credit drawn near its limit, back payments owed to 2 vendors I had never heard of mentioned in connection with the business. The numbers added up to a company that was, by Russ's presentation, more burden than asset. He said he and Lee had spoken with a business attorney. He said their recommendation was a clean transfer, that Lee would assume full ownership, absorb the liabilities, and that my releasing my stake now would protect me from being pulled into what he called a prolonged unwinding. He said all of this with tremendous generosity in his voice. I asked to keep the folder. He hesitated for about 2 seconds before he said, "Of course." I did not sleep that night, but not for the reason he would have assumed. The first thing I did the next morning was pull Evergreen's most recent filed tax return, which I had helped my father prepare. Then I accessed the state's business registry and pulled the UCC filings, the official public record of secured loans against business assets. Then I called my father's accountant, a man named Mr. Beaumont, who had done the company's books for 11 years, and I asked him, as carefully as I could, whether he was aware of any outstanding vendor liabilities to two companies called Westfield Ground Supply and DRK Equipment Holdings. He was quiet for a moment, then he said he'd never heard of either of them. I thanked him and hung up and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the folder Russ had left behind. Neither company appeared in any public business registry in the state. Westfield Ground Supply had a website with a contact form and no physical address. DRK Equipment Holdings returned no results at all on any commercial database I could access. The line of credit Russ had cited did exist, but the drawn balance on the most recent statement my father had shared with me was less than a quarter of the figure in Russ's summary. The equipment loan figures were similarly inflated, in 2 cases citing serial numbers for machinery the company no longer owned. I knew this because I had helped process the sale of that equipment 2 years earlier, and I still had the transfer documentation in my email. What Russ had handed me was not a valuation, it was a construction. A believable one, built out of real institutional names and real financial concepts, dressed up in the language of professional advice, designed for someone who would look at the highlighted totals and feel the ground shift under them instead of reaching for a second opinion. I bought a small digital recorder at the office supply store on my lunch break the following day. I tested it in my car twice. Then I called Lee and told her I had been thinking about what she and Russ had said and that I wanted to have dinner before I made any decisions, that I needed to feel like we'd talk through it as a family. She said of course. She suggested a restaurant near their neighborhood, a place with good lighting and a bar program that Russ liked to mention. I suggested somewhere quieter, a small Italian place on Corfield Avenue where I have eaten enough times to know the corner booths and the acoustics. She agreed. I arrived 12 minutes early. I sat in the corner booth and I ordered water and I put the recorder in the interior pocket of my bag where the zipper pull faces outward and started it before they came through the door. Russ ordered a drink immediately. Lee ordered the same. They were in a good mood, the kind of calibrated warmth people perform when they want you to feel comfortable making a decision. We talked about nothing for a while. The service at the funeral home, a cousin's new baby, whether the restaurant had changed its pasta. Then I said, with what I hoped was the right amount of hesitation, "I've been thinking about what you showed me. I want to make sure I understand. If I retain my share and try to address these liabilities myself, what does that actually look like?" Russ leaned forward. He set his drink down, and then he explained, in specific terms and at a volume that required no enhancement from any recording device, that if I did not sign the transfer quickly, he would pursue legal action to recover what he described as his personal investment in the company's operations over the past several years. He named a figure. It was not a small figure. He said the name of a judge he claimed to know. He said that a prolonged dispute would be damaging to my professional reputation, that the credit union I worked for did business with several of his firm's commercial clients, and that he would not be shy about making connections. Lee put her hand on his arm at one point, not to stop him but to pace him. Then she added several things about my relationship with our father, about the nature of my involvement in the business, about what she called my habit of inserting myself into things that weren't my responsibility. "I will share all of it because I think you deserve the full picture and because the recording made discretion unnecessary." She said my father had told her privately that he'd always felt I overstepped, that he had added me to the ownership structure reluctantly, because he didn't want conflict, not because he believed I had earned it. She said this with the particular confidence of someone delivering a wound they've been carrying for a while, the kind that requires an audience to feel complete. I want to pause here because I've thought about this moment more than any other in the last year. The version of me from 3 years ago would have felt the floor drop, would have spent weeks replaying the sentence, testing it for truth, letting it do the damage it was designed to do. What I felt instead, sitting in that booth, was something closer to clarity. My father had worked alongside me for 6 years. He had called me on Sunday mornings to talk through contract language. He had forwarded me vendor emails at 11 at night with question marks and trusted me to answer them. Whatever Lee believed she was delivering across that table, it wasn't what she said it was. It was a tool. And I had already decided I was not the kind of person who could be taken apart by a tool I could see. I nodded. I said I needed a few more days to think. They looked satisfied in a way they didn't bother to hide. 3 days later, I was sitting across from an attorney named Ms. Vance in her office on Pendleton Street. She specializes in business disputes and estate litigation. She reviewed the fabricated valuation documents, the UCC filing discrepancies, the non-existent vendor entities, and the recording. She was quiet through most of it in the way that good lawyers are quiet, not absence of reaction, but containment of it. When she was done, she said, "This is coercion and it's documented." What I did not know until that meeting, what Ms. Vance found in the original trust and partnership agreement my father had filed with the company's formation documents, was that he had included a clause, standard in some jurisdictions, rarely enforced, almost never tested in a small family business context. Any co-owner who could be shown to have used fraudulent documentation, threats, or material misrepresentation to induce another co-owner to surrender their interest would be barred from assuming that interest. The transfer would be void. Their existing ownership stake would be subject to forfeiture in favor of the defrauded party. My father was not a lawyer, but he had hired a careful one at the beginning, and he had read what he signed, and he had kept the documents in a fireproof box in the back of his office closet that I found while cleaning out his desk the month after he died. The same box where he kept my sister's college graduation photo and mine, and a handwritten note I am still not ready to describe to anyone. I did not tell Lee or Russ about Ms. Vance. I went through the signing process exactly as they had arranged it. I showed up to the notary's office with what I hoped was the correct expression. Careful. Slightly reluctant. Someone who has made a hard decision and is moving through it. The notary worked for a title company. The paperwork was prepared by an attorney Lee had retained. That attorney, I would later learn, had reviewed the fraudulent valuation documents and incorporated their figures into the transfer language without independent verification. That oversight would become relevant to him in a different context, later. I signed every page. I initialed every margin. Leigh was standing near the window. Her shoulders had that set to them that I described at the beginning. Russ was already on his phone. In the hallway outside, I had 7 minutes. I used them to forward 3 files to Ms. Vance's secured client portal, the recording, the scanned fabricated documents alongside the authenticated public records showing the discrepancies, and the relevant section of my father's original partnership agreement. Miss Vance had been expecting them. She had prepared the filing while I was in the notary's office and needed only the final confirmation before she submitted. She submitted while I was washing my hands in the hallway restroom. Russ's phone buzzed first. I watched him look at the screen with the face of a man receiving information his nervous system isn't ready for. He stepped away from Lee and raised the phone to his ear. Lee watched him. His voice dropped. Then he turned and looked at me across the lobby, and his face had the specific expression of a person who has just understood that the person they thought they were managing was, in fact, managing them. I held the door open on my way out. Not for theater. I just wanted some air. The outcome took 9 weeks. The transfer was nullified on the grounds of documented coercive fraud. The fabricated valuation documents formed the basis of a separate civil filing. Lee's attorney received a referral to the State Bar's disciplinary board for incorporating fraudulent financial data into a legal instrument without due diligence. Russ, to my knowledge, has not spoken my name since. The company is mine now. Not half of it. All of it. Which was the legal consequence of the forfeiture clause my father had the foresight to include 31 years ago when he was starting a business he hoped would last. I want to be honest about what winning looked like because this kind of story is easy to tell wrong. I cried in my car for 40 minutes the day the ruling came through. Not from happiness. Grief doesn't wait for convenient moments, and it doesn't care if you're also relieved. I missed my father with a completeness that still catches me off guard when I'm doing ordinary things, buying coffee, parallel parking, reading a contract, and thinking of something I'd want to ask him. The company is still running. Mr. Beaumont still does the books. 3 of the crew members, who have worked for Evergreen since before I could drive, came to the office the week after the ruling and shook my hand, and one of them, a man who has mowed the hospital campus every Thursday for 11 years, said your dad would be glad, and I had to look at the ceiling for a while before I could answer. I changed my phone number. I moved. I donated the suit I wore to the notary appointment because I didn't want it in my closet. I had 2 sessions with a therapist who works with clients navigating grief and family estrangement. She said something I keep coming back to, that people who have been relied on heavily by families that don't acknowledge it often spend years performing a kind of invisible competence, making themselves useful as a way of making themselves safe, and that the moment someone tries to strip that usefulness away is the moment you find out what was actually underneath it. She meant this as an insight, not a verdict. I'm still sitting with what it means. Here's what I come back to most. The folder Russ put on my table was meant to work because he had watched me carry things quietly for years, and he assumed that quiet meant pliable. He was not entirely wrong about the quiet, but he had the wrong read on what it meant. My father kept handwritten ledgers going back 31 years. He laminated his maintenance logs. He included a clause in his original partnership documents that his own daughter tried to use against his other daughter, and that, in the end, made sure neither attempt succeeded. He was not a man who said a great deal about what he believed or how much he was paying attention. I think about that sometimes. About what it costs to pay that kind of attention and say nothing. About all the things people build into their decisions before they're gone, that the people left behind only find when they're looking for something else entirely. I want to ask you something, and I want it to land as a real question. How many times have you been handed a document, a story, a number, an explanation, by someone who was counting on you not to read it carefully? And what would have happened if you had? There's something I keep coming back to, and I don't think I'll stop coming back to it for a long time. Russ put that folder on my kitchen table because he had watched me carry things quietly for years and decided that quiet meant I could be moved. He was not entirely wrong about the quiet. I am someone who works through things internally, who double-checks before speaking, who would rather spend an evening with a highlighter and a set of documents than make a scene at a dinner table. He saw that and he read it as softness. That was his first mistake, and it was an honest one, because a lot of people make it. Stillness and weakness look similar from the outside until they don't. What I've thought about most isn't Lee or Russ or even the outcome. What I think about is the chain of choices that had to happen for everything to land the way it did. Russ had to believe I wouldn't look closely. Leigh had to believe the version of me she'd constructed in her head, the younger sister, the one who had always just handled things without asking for recognition, was more real than the person actually sitting across from her at that table. Their attorney had to believe that incorporating unverified numbers into a legal instrument was someone else's problem to catch. Every single one of those choices was a decision to skip a step, to assume rather than verify, to move fast because they believed the other person wouldn't. I had spent 6 years learning that the fine print is where the truth lives, that patience is not a personality trait, it's a professional skill, and it transfers. I don't think my father taught me that directly. I think I learned it by watching him. By watching a man who kept handwritten ledgers going back decades, who laminated maintenance logs, who included a clause in a 30-year-old partnership document because he understood that the people who love you are also, sometimes, the people most capable of believing they're entitled to what you've built. He didn't warn me about Lee. I think he didn't because he hoped he was wrong. But he prepared for the possibility that he wasn't, and that preparation, filed quietly, stored in a fireproof box behind a graduation photo, is what made everything else possible. He did the work before I knew I would need it. That's a kind of love I'm still learning how to hold. Here is what I believe about the way this unfolded. Actions that are built on fabrication require constant maintenance. You have to remember which numbers you changed and by how much. You have to keep the people you're deceiving from talking to the people who know the truth. You have to move fast because time is the enemy of a constructed story. Russ moved fast. He came to my apartment within the week. The calls and the pressure and the dinner, all of it had the pace of someone who knew the structure would not survive examination. I slowed down. I asked one more question. I drove to an office supply store and spent $14 on a recorder. And then I let them talk. The outcomes followed from the choices. Not immediately, not cleanly, and not without cost, but they followed. Lee lost the company she had never worked to build because she tried to take it using methods that couldn't survive documentation. I kept it not because I was lucky, but because I had spent years building the kind of competence that looks like nothing from the outside and turns out to matter completely when it's actually needed. I'm not interested in telling this as a story about winning. I'm interested in telling it as a story about attention. About what it means to read carefully, to move slowly when everyone around you is manufacturing urgency, to trust what you know even when someone you grew up with is telling you confidently that you have it wrong. My father kept records because he understood that the truth doesn't protect itself. You have to do that work yourself, ahead of time, before you know what you'll need it for. I'm still learning to do that. I think I will be for a while.